Have you ever looked at Prinz Eugen's shipwreck and wondered why it's there? And I don't mean how did it get there. If you're watching this video, you probably already know how, but if you are unfamiliar, Prinz Eugen was a part of the nuclear weapons test Operation Crossroads. She survived 2 nuclear bombs, except she also became covered in radioactive material. U.S. Navy personnel didn't want to board the ship before cleaning it up, so they sent her away to Kwajalein Atoll, where she sat for months. Eventually, something like a valve or a sea chest broke and started to flood the ship. The personnel tried to save Prinz Eugen by beaching her, but they were too late. She capsized and sank only a few hundred feet from shore. What I want to know is, why is it still there? The wreck is in such shallow water that parts of it are permanently exposed. Why hasn't anyone come back over the last 80 years to salvage it? As it turns out, there was a time when people wanted to remove the wreck. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Marshall Islanders living in the atoll wanted to salvage Prinz Eugen, partially as underwater salvage training and partially to sell the material for its scrap value. So in 1974, the U.S. Navy sent a survey team to Kwajalein as part of a feasibility study. Their main goal was to find hazards in and around the wreck that might complicate salvage attempts, but also they needed to know the wreck's scrap value and if they could recover the wreck in one piece or if they had to break it up in place. Prinz Eugen lies inverted and slightly leaning on her starboard side. She's only about 600 feet from the shore, so she's also on the slope that leads up to the island. During low tide, the water is about 110 feet deep by the bow, while at the stern, the water is only about 25 feet. The stern is in such shallow water that the port and center props are permanently exposed along with the rudder. This survey found the hull was reasonably intact, although the port side was damaged amidship. They couldn't explain where it came from, but even with that damage, they thought it was still technically possible to refloat the wreck, and they might even be able to bring it back upright again, depending on what they found on board. It's important to remember that the metals that make up the ship and that they'd be salvaging are not radioactive and never were. The concern came from the radioactive material and particles that covered the ship after the nuclear explosions. If they were still attached to the hull and superstructure, and the divers could detect radiation with their sensors, then the Navy would not salvage the ship because they didn't want to accidentally deliver radioactive material to smelters and scrapyards. Luckily for them, they did not detect any radiation coming from the metal. However, those particles were not the only potential source of radiation that they were worried about. When Prinz Eugen was built, it was very common to use radium in paint that you wanted to glow in the dark. The paint was mostly used in dials and gauges and things like that. The Germans were not covering the walls with it, but any amount was going to be a problem for recovering the wreck. They decided that if they found anything with radium, they could still salvage Prinz Eugen. They would just need to find and remove everything with it beforehand. The divers did eventually find a flask with radium on it, so there was some radioactive material on the wreck, but it wasn't really that big of a deal. It was nothing that posed a risk to the divers, and it was not enough to put an end to any salvage ideas. The real issue was with the other stuff on board. The point of Operation Crossroads was to simulate a nuclear attack on a fleet. To help make the test more realistic, every ship carried some amount of ammunition and fuel. I haven't been able to find the exact numbers for the ammunition on Prinz Eugen, but the surveyors believed there was more than 300 tons scattered around the ship, including a handful of torpedoes still on their storage racks. Of course, ammunition is dangerous, especially when it's been underwater for so long, except the explosives are still reasonably safe and shouldn't just randomly explode. In fact, the divers were more worried about the torpedoes' compressed air tanks than their warheads. As for the fuel, we do have better numbers for how much was on board. In 2018, the U.S. Navy removed almost 230,000 gallons of oil, while leaving behind an estimated 13,300 gallons. although back in 1974 there probably would have been more fuel. The surveyors found some of it leaking from the hull in 2 spots, and that probably continued after they left. Even with the ammunition and fuel, salvaging the wreck was still technically possible. It just makes things a lot more complicated. They would need to remove the fuel before trying to recover the ship or breaking it up in place. Then, they'd need to go through the ship to safely remove and dispose of the ammunition, along with anything that had the radium paint. Needless to say, that cost a lot of money just to get the ship into a salvageable state. After all, it's not just the cost of removing the fuel and ammunition. Kwajalein is a fairly remote atoll. I mean, they use the Marshall Islands as a nuclear testing area for a reason. It's thousands of miles from anywhere with salvaging or shipbreaking equipment, so they'd have to bring everything they needed across the Pacific to the atoll. The surveyors estimated the cost of salvaging Prinz Eugen in 1975 at around $7.5 million, or about $45 million in today's money. The estimated total value of scrap was only about $1.5 million, or $9 million today. The cost of salvaging far outweighed the value of any scrap or underwater training. Plus, Eugen was not blocking a shipping channel or really in the way of anything, so there wasn't any other reason to justify removing the wreck entirely. The only salvage work the survey recommended was to remove the oil, since it was leaking and an environmental hazard. But that didn't happen for a while. The only thing the Navy did shortly after this survey was in 1978, when it removed the portside propeller and gifted it to West Germany. Today, salvaging the wreck would be a bit more difficult. The oil is gone, but the ammunition is still there. Plus, the wreck's condition reached a point where it might not be possible to refloat. Over the last 50 years, the hull around the port side shaft has corroded through, leaving a giant opening. The rest of the wreck has also corroded in that time, but there hasn't been any detailed survey to figure out if it could survive refloating. The Navy did measure hull thickness on the fuel tanks in 2018, but that's far from a real structural survey. Even if you still could refloat the wreck or wanted to break it up in place, Prinz Eugen has become a very popular diving spot. It would kind of be like robbing the Marshall Islands' diving industry, and the Marshall Islands also owns the wreck, so I can't imagine they'd be willing to remove it now. Eugen probably isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Now, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, please let me know, and I'll make more of these for more ships. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss those, and I'll see you next time.